Moving on to our third speaker, and I'm delighted to introduce Pat Furlong. Victor and I had a delightful dinner with Pat last night, and I must say, Pat is really a crusader in very many respects, in a true American spirit, and that is a crusader who's been spurred by both experience and, I dare say, hardship. Pat is a former nurse. She is a mother and a tireless advocate for better treatment and care of patients. Her two sons died of Duchenne muscular dystrophy, the most common fatal genetic disorder diagnosed in childhood, affecting approximately 1 out of every 3,500 male births. I mentioned male and underline that because, dare I say, Pat is our only female speaker here. I don't know why that's the case, but I do take special note, and it's a delight to have her here. Her experience with the healthcare system before and after both her boys' deaths, which incidentally was not very pleasant, to say the least, given the stories I heard last night, spurred Pat to borrow $100,000 without her husband's knowledge and to set up the present foundation in 1994. Today, the parent project Muscular Dystrophy Foundation is the largest nonprofit organization in the United States focused entirely on Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Pat is going to tell us her story today and outline the lessons learned and how to build an advocacy movement. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Larry, for inviting me. As the only woman speaker, and certainly one that is speaking on rare disease, I think we've taken a left turn away from proteomics and genomics and all of those very technical discussions to talk about Duchenne today. So thank you for that. I wanted to also say thank you. In the talks yesterday, they said that family practitioners were going to be something of the past. My husband's a family practitioner. Please let him work for the next 10 years while I have to kill him. And I'm very happy that nurses are going to take over the world, since I am one, and I'd really like to run the primary care in the United States. So if that job is open, I certainly would like to take it on. Now, not that I would be successful, but I think that there is much room to improve. I'd like to start by reading something that will introduce an Institute of Medicine report that hopefully will be in print in September. And it will start off with, "Nature is nowhere accustomed more openly to display her secret mysteries than in cases where she shows tracings of her workings apart from the beaten paths. Nor is there any better way to advance the proper practice of medicine than to give our minds to the discovery of the usual law of nature by careful investigation of the cases of rarer forms of disease." William Harvey said that in 1657. So I'm here to talk about Duchenne muscular dystrophy. I am a nurse. In 1984, my sons were diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. It was sort of an unusual thing because I had 4 children in 1984. They were 4, 6, 8, and 10. My 2 sons were the youngest. And I'd noticed from the time they were born and as they missed their motor milestones that there was a weakness. It wasn't something I could easily complain about to a husband who was a football player for Notre Dame. And when they saw their very well-developed calf muscles, I heard that those were football muscles. And actually, for football muscles, they didn't seem to run or walk or climb in any way that was seemingly normal to me. So I complained to my husband repeatedly and to various physicians repeatedly. And you will notice on the slide prior to this that one of, is that right? Wait, where am I going, backward? Okay, there. That probably the best degree that I've ever achieved is DM, Desperate Mom. I was called that from the time my children were born and when they were diagnosed, and I think it continues today. So I think that is where I'll start. So I like advocating for children. Often they can't advocate for themselves because they have a catastrophic illness and are predicted to die before they'll have a voice or they'll become an adult. When your child is diagnosed with a catastrophic illness, there's a sadness that comes over you that's beyond words, beyond anger, beyond understanding. It blankets you. You fall into a deep abyss of darkness. You cover your eyes. You sit on the floor in a corner and hope the world will change. And then you find that you have to find your feet because at somewhere along the line you're going to have to stand up. You hear a diagnosis, an illness, you can't even recognize it. You're going to learn a new language, you're going to learn a new vocabulary, you're going to talk to people like physicians and scientists like Larry Gold who say words that you really have to have a diagnosis and a dictionary and some sort of translation from what appears to be a foreign language into this particular kind of language that will be all new to you. What choice do you really have anyway? By definition, you're going to become an advocate. You're going to have to explain this diagnosis to your family, to maybe your children, to your extended family who will assume that this child looks pretty good to me today, so how in the world could he or she be unhealthy? And you'll hear that repeatedly through your life. You'll have to explain it to the extended family. Frankly, you'll have to explain this disease to your primary care provider because it is likely that you'll hear the words, "You're going to know this disease much better than I will," which puts you in the driver's seat, unfortunately. And if you think about who's going to be in charge anyway, you have to think about you're going to be the first one who expressed a concern. You're going to be the one who complained or went from doctor to doctor to doctor. Your primary care provider may have dismissed you. At some point, after seeing every doctor you can imagine, someone will say a disease and diagnose the symptoms that have become so familiar to you. And you'll begin then a journey that searches for expertise and experience, and I guarantee you that won't be an easy trek, because there are few in the rare disease community that will know this disease or have experience with this disease or frankly be invested in this disease. And when you find that expert after traveling perhaps miles and miles across continents sometimes, you will find a person who spends perhaps an hour with you, and if you're lucky, an hour twice a year. And if you think about it, if you have an expert for 4 hours, and you have the rest of the year, which is 8,700 and some hours in a year, the bulk of the time with this particular patient is yours. And so you, the patient, or the family member, or the person who loves this child who is ill, is frankly in charge. And that's a pretty heavy burden to bear, to be in charge of a rare disease that you know nothing about, to hear words like proteomics and genomics and genetic testing, standards of care, clinical trials, what does all that mean, and try to make sense of it in a single day. If you take a step back, you can think that this child is the same child he or she was the day before the diagnosis or the year before the diagnosis. So you have that. And so as a parent, you have now more information and you have more ways to act, and you will need to do exactly that. So you may be up against a number of things, and I think in all diseases we're often up against these things. They include ignorance, apathy, mediocrity, therapeutic nihilism, a host of things to include lack of awareness, lack of knowledge, lack of investment. When my sons were diagnosed, within 3 days I was at the NIH, and I said to them, so after lying and stealing and cheating my way through to the top, and the director of the NIH, I said, what are you doing in Duchenne? And the director said to me, nothing. It's really not on our radar screen. Now, I'll tell you as a mother, having borrowed $100,000 to do my own private feasibility study against my husband, I had a little war going on at home, you might imagine. I got to the NIH and found I was in another little war where the NIH, the government that I paid taxes to, had no real interest in this disease that was going to ultimately kill my children. So that was sort of disappointing to me, you might understand. I went then to my representatives in Congress who said, well, we don't like to intervene in the NIH because they just really fund the best science, and that's what their job is, to fund the best science. I said, well, if the best science isn't going to really help my sons, and the best science is on the common diseases, when do I get to be in the queue for them to be thinking that maybe there is some good science to be had in the world of Duchenne muscular dystrophy? As you might imagine, he didn't really have an answer for me that day. So let me just introduce you to my sons. These are my two boys in 1994. Chris and Pat could no longer walk. They couldn't move their arms. They had difficulty with breathing, although it was dismissed. And frankly, I went to the physician and said to them way at the beginning of the disease, when they were walking, my sons are flat-footed, and they seemed sometimes when they're not flat-footed, they walk on their toes. And if I gave them arches or stretched out that tendon, would that help them to walk? And the physician said to me, "You're really crazy. What difference does it make? They will go off their feet." I said, "Well, we're not talking about later. We're talking about early in the diagnosis, and we're talking about saving time with their ability to walk, stretching it a bit." So I learned lessons from my sons that you get out of the box, you ask questions, you don't hesitate, you speak to audiences like this, even if you feel a little bit intimidated, and then you begin the path forward. With my sons in the chair and not moving, I said to the physician, "I think that they might be going into heart failure." He said, "No, of course they aren't. Heart failure, even though the heart's affected in Duchenne, it doesn't get affected until they're 20, and they're only 15. How would we imagine that?" I said, "Well, it seems to me if the muscle's degenerating and the heart's a muscle, maybe all that's wrapped up together somehow." He said, "Nope, not till you're 20. They died of heart failure." Duchenne muscular dystrophy is X-linked. Girls are carriers, boys have the disease. It is familiar. 60% of the time it's predictable. We see it in families, and we can predict that each pregnancy carries a 50% risk of either having a child with Duchenne, a boy with Duchenne, or a daughter who's a carrier. When my boys were diagnosed, the physician said to me, "Surely you knew, this is in your family. I'm sure you have a brother or a cousin or some relative with Duchenne, and how did you not know, and you could have terminated these pregnancies?" Well, I'll tell you, it was a very bad start to my relationship with this neurologist as I pulled him by the tie up to my face and said, "If somebody dies today, it's you. So my boys are here, and I'd appreciate it if we just talk about today." So as you can understand, my relationship with physicians isn't very good, although with my husband of 38 years, it's progressively getting better, but not over the $100,000 investment. So in Duchenne, the children look normal at birth. They look like healthy little boys. They progress through their disease and that they gain skills, although they're delayed. By the time they're 10 or 12, in this day and age, they would be taking corticosteroids. They would progressively improve in their late teens or early teens. They would lose function. They would lose their ability to walk. They lose their ability to move their arms. Breathing becomes impaired because the intercostal muscles and the diaphragm are weak. The heart is affected from diagnosis, and they typically die now into their 30s. So I am married. I do have 4 children. I have a 36-year-old daughter and a 34-year-old daughter, no grandchildren, but I'm promoting that so I can give you their names if you'd like to send them an email. I'm not allowed to ask. The physicians are still saying there's no hope and no help. They say this routinely to parents. They tell them to go home and love them. They tell them that surely they knew that this is familial and predictable, but actually 40% of the cases of Duchenne muscular dystrophy are spontaneous. I'm a spontaneous carrier in my family. So I am a first-generation carrier. I do have a daughter who's a carrier. In this case, what happens is it can happen in conception. This is one of the largest genes in the human genome. It's 79 exons, 2.5 million base pairs. It spontaneously mutates in the egg and sperm of ladies and gentlemen, and sometimes it happens because the mom has gonadal mosaicism, so her eggs are affected, and sometimes it happens in conception. So anyone can have a child with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. You might understand, I was outraged then, I continue to be outraged, and so I decided to act in 1984 by the $100,000 feasibility study, and 1994 I started a company called Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy. I think advocating for children or advocating for someone you love is really translated into something called the creative use of outrage, and I think that that is how we have to approach things, and that is certainly how I approach things in my life. So this is really about something else for me. This is really about looking at patient care and saying, I don't have a magic wand. I can't cure you today, but I can look today and see if I can buy 5 more minutes of quality time, 5 more minutes of lifetime, and maybe invest in something that will buy much more than that, and I'll stack the 5 minutes up until I have a lifetime of a difference. So this is about not ever accepting the word no. My husband will tell you I don't even start sentences with no, and if he does, I'm sure to get even. So my frustration was shared by many people. I had met parents as I traveled in my study who had the same concerns. I really wanted to understand the landscape. What do we know? What do we need to know? I developed a list of 150 questions. I would lie my way into research offices or physicians' offices. I would call them and say, I'm Dr. Furlong, one of my best friends has a son with Duchenne. Could I come and speak to you? That was the only way I could get in the door that time. Keep in mind, in 1984, we didn't have the internet. We had planes, trains, automobiles, and fax machines, and that's the way I navigated. I would go down into medical libraries. I would do literature searches. I would look at who wrote those publications, and I made a spreadsheet, and I went to see them one by one around the world. And I got them together. And then I said, I want you all to come together and meet, because they sure netted me out as tears came to my eyes about my sons. So I decided to have a meeting, and I wanted to invite all of these really brilliant people to come together and work with me. I said, I'll do anything. I'll find you money, I'll find you time, I'll find you others, I'll fund fellowships, I'll steal, I'll lie. As you can see, I already did. So they said they wouldn't come, and they didn't really want to meet with a parent because they thought I was a little crazy. So one of the investigators said to me, well, who would be the incentive for me to come to this meeting? So it just so happened that Time magazine was right there on the table, and I said, him. On that day in Time magazine, there was Francis Collins and French Anderson, who did the first gene therapy experiment. So I said, so French Anderson's a really good friend of mine, and he's going to lead the meeting. So the next day I was on a plane to USC. I sat outside of his office, talked to his secretary, and tried to bribe him into leading the meeting, and he did. So he walked into the meeting, and the investigators came, and he said, I'm going to cure Duchenne muscular dystrophy in 18 months. And I thought they were going to have heart attacks right there and never come back. But it started a dialogue. And from that day, when we started the dialogue about what are the needs, why isn't it true that he could cure Duchenne muscular dystrophy in 18 months, what are the tools you have, what are the tools you don't have, I wrote on the back of literally a napkin a business plan that included identifying centers of excellence and investing in them, having fellowships around them to support it, core animal facilities, both large and small animal core facilities would be needed. I understood as a nurse that we needed standards of care instead of, well, I don't know what to do. So we needed standards of care. And you have already heard about the Muscular Dystrophy Association. That was a sort of the big elephant in the room that was very difficult to get around because they don't collect data, they didn't have standards of care, and I was a crazy mom that they really didn't appreciate. So we needed all of these things, and we decided to start by having our first center of excellence. So we went to Eric Hoffman, who was at the University of Pittsburgh, and we said, why don't you be a center? Now, for those of you who do scientific review, I can imagine that you said, you know, what was the proposal, what was the review process, who made the decision, and how much money did you invest? Well, here's the story. In 1994, there weren't many people involved in Duchenne muscular dystrophy research. There wasn't much money. And at the University of Pittsburgh, there was a critical mass of investigators that seemed to have an interest in Duchenne. They were geneticists, they were virologists, they were stem cell folks, they were imaging. So they seemed to be at least a group of people that could routinely be coerced into coming to meetings, ask their friends, and begin to build a critical mass. So they agreed to start there. We lost our first scientific director because he didn't like our process, and that was just one of those things. So we then started there. We started also in parallel. We created a large animal facility at the University of Missouri. We created a mouse testing facility at the University of Buffalo. And we then went out to UCLA and said to them, you know, the immune aspects of this disease are pretty significant. It looks like because there's a fundamental protein missing that as the cell starts to degrade, the immune system cleans up. And it seems like if it cleaned up a little less, perhaps we'd get a downstream effect of having a little more muscle power for a little longer period of time. So we started a second center at UCLA, and those two centers began to build momentum. We then went to Washington, and we began to try one by one to find some friends in Congress. We did. And in 2001, we coerced, maybe, Senator Specter into holding a hearing. It was the first hearing in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. We broadened it to be muscular dystrophy for political reasons and for advocacy reasons. So we broadened it out. He had a hearing. We testified in the hearing and said this is an important area of research. Certainly the muscular dystrophy, specifically for me, Duchenne muscular dystrophy. My boys were gone by that time, but it still is going to be where my heart hangs, especially at first. And Senator Specter listened. In parallel, we were able to get our champions in Congress to introduce a bill called the Muscular Dystrophy Care Act. So the Muscular Dystrophy Care Act was introduced in Congress on Valentine's Day in 2001. It was passed into law in December of 2001. It was probably one of the first and only bills to go through in that session of Congress. And that didn't bring money. It was an authorization bill. But what it did, it brought an emphasis to this disease. So the real proponents of the bill and also gave us loopholes. So one of them was to create centers of excellence. There are now 6 Wellstone centers. Those are centers of excellence in Duchenne and all the muscular dystrophies. They have to have a basic science component, they have to have a clinical component, and they have to collaborate and have common animal colonies to use. So we felt that that was a very good opportunity. One of the other things it had is that something for CDC and the National Center of Birth Defects and Developmental Disabilities. And why there? Because they have a pot of money we could use. So frankly, we earmarked money into there, and that was where I really felt we could drive home some surveillance, because we didn't even know who these children were. We didn't know who they were, where they were. We didn't know their genetic tests. We didn't know if they had genetic tests or their genetic mutations. We didn't know what they looked like. We didn't know what they were taking. We didn't know anything. So we went to CDC and asked them to do some surveillance. We also felt that with some careful legislative language that we could navigate through standards of care, because we couldn't get them any other way. So we did exactly that. They did a retrospective study to look at Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which was before steroids. And then I developed Duchenne Connect, which is a patient self-report registry on a platform from a man who makes platforms for patient self-report registries. And it is probably now one of the best registries in rare diseases. What the beauty of the Duchenne Connect registry is, it has online genetic counseling so that patients can get genetic testing. The data is curated, it dumps into the National Center of Bioinformatics and into a global database, because we have to have the data that is meaningful for industry, for participation in clinical trials, for knowledge of care and how to improve it, and then we can look at gaps. This year, and published in Lancet, was the standard of care for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and now I've evaluated that for gaps, asked the clinicians to come on board to look at those gaps, and we'll be doing workshops to plug into that gap to be proactive about care. This is really about creating an organization called Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy, where parents are responsible partners not only with their son's care, with the clinicians who care for them, with the researchers who are doing the care, with the companies who are invested in this space. And for all of you in VC out there, I know that you're not interested in nonprofits, but I'll take your checks anytime you want to give them. So we look at it very simply is this not moving? Okay. We are advocates, we improve care, we fund research, we are partners with industry, and we are educating the world. We did a pilot study in Mississippi. Mississippi is a very poor state, and when we looked at the birth and death records of children with Duchenne muscular dystrophy for a 10-year span, we found that they die earlier in Mississippi. So I went down to Mississippi and partnered with people who saw children in their early years of life to understand what happens when someone expresses concern about the motor function of a child, who sees the child, what happens to that concern, how is it interpreted, how is it expressed, how is it interpreted, and what happens is a parent expresses concern. The physician in the office who sees them often doesn't take time to watch them walk, jump, or climb, because that's where you'd see the delay. From a child standing who is standing and jumps on mom's lap and back off, you're not going to see a motor delay. So we found that there is a misinterpretation of the facts, not being able to see the child walk, jump, or climb. You don't see the muscle weakness. We found primary care providers don't recognize muscle weakness in a young child. We found that even if they see or understand or worry about what mom has expressed, the delay in terms of getting to a neurologist might be anywhere from 6 to 18 months in Mississippi. So there's a delay in diagnosis by recognition, a delay by the ability to refer. And certainly we see then the delay in this diagnosis for anywhere from 2 to 4 years, which is totally unacceptable because we think we have treatments on the horizon and we know we can intervene with good care anyway. So we can extend and buy those 5 minutes. So we need to know these children. We are working on newborn screening, but I think that's going to be a while before we get it in Duchenne. So PPMD looks at this as a race. We seed projects, we leverage funds, we partner with industry. We always seed projects, but in seeding any project, we want to see where the next dollar is coming from, because it won't really help us if we seed a project and it goes nowhere, or the investigator can't get the RON or can't get something better from NIH. And as most of you know with the NIH process, young investigators have a little bit of trouble getting through. Also with their budget constraints, you can't sometimes even get in there if you're good. So we also created the GAP program, which is a bridging program with the NIH, so that we see all the Duchenne grants that are coming in there that aren't funded, and then we have the opportunity to go in there and either fund a certain aim or bridge that grant and then try to coerce or push a resubmission and then get these people funded in the end. We also partner with industry. We go to industry and see where their interests lie and if we can partner and if whatever pathways they're looking at might be useful in Duchenne. And we try to be as good a partners as we can. We try to have very careful communication both ways, back and forth. We complain to each other, they complain about us being harassing them, and then we do, and then we try to get over that issue. Because as you can imagine, when your child has diagnosed at 6 and predicted to die before 25, you really don't have a lot of time, so harassing is part of the job. We advocate in Congress. We are continuously in the face because priorities in Congress change. We look for pots of money in every opportunity. We get money from the Department of Defense. We are now working with them on a telemedicine project because I worry about people who have to fly miles away to get expertise to go home to a family practitioner or someday a nurse who won't really know what's happening. So I think telemedicine has to be part and parcel of what we do in rare disease. Otherwise, even if we're successful, they may fail at home. So we can't let that happen. We look at care and gaps in care. We find workshops and we plan workshops around gaps. We bring in people from outside like rheumatologists and people who wouldn't ordinarily be in this space because I think we get in a rut and then we forget to really look outside the box to see how can we treat these children in a different way, in a better way, and for that matter, for all rare disease, we've got to look differently at them if we're going to make headway in them and give these people quality lives and expand their life, give them more lifespan, even if it's only 5 minutes. You know, when you love someone, 5 minutes is really something better than less, right? And we educate. We try to use every teachable moment to teach someone about Duchenne. I think using generalizable systems in rare disease are going to be critical. I think there has to be a law where children don't suffer, where children who have rare diseases are counted among the most valuable, and we really strive to make them have quality lives, longer lives, and we are innovative about getting them treatments and cure. So I think this journey for me has been a good one. I'm here, for heaven's sake, in the face of all of this amazing, amazing talent, and I'm just a nurse, as you will, if you ask my husband, he'll tell you. For me, it is using compassion and passion to try to change a world that dramatically needs changing. One of our very best success stories I want you to see is 3 little boys who participated in a trial of Adalurin. Adalurin is a stop codon suppression drug from a company in New Jersey called PTC Therapeutics. I saw this coming and growing, and I have to say that this is a fault of people in nonprofits like me, because I was aware of this drug in 1999. Our scientific director said to me, I used gentamicin and I was able to overcome stops. And I think that this might be useful for about 10% of the Duchenne community. And I said to him, well, I'm an old nurse. We used Gent in the flu epidemic of 1972. We killed a lot of people. We lost a lot of hearing, and I don't like gentamicin at all, so I don't like it. What are you going to do for me about that? So later came to find out that PTC Therapeutics was working on the stop suppression drug. They worked with Lee Sweeney, and he certainly was a collaborator on bringing the drug forward. I used that as an opening to go into PTC Therapeutics and said, I really love it that you're working on 10%, maybe 15% of our population, but actually we have another 85% that needs treating. Could we think about forming a collaboration with you, use some validated targets, use your GEMS technology to do high throughput screens, and leverage some more money as much as we can and do some drug development to treat the other 85% of the boys. So these are 3 of the boys in trial. This particular trial on the phase 2b failed its primary and secondary outcomes, which was devastating. They suspended the trial. The suspension of the trial was devastating to the community. We've been working with PTC. Sub-analysis reveals that the lower dose is effective, and hopefully on a call that we've organized again on May 27th with PTC and 400 others, they will describe their plans for going forward, and hopefully that will include an access program and a trial, or at least conditional approval or some sort of vehicle to get these 3 beautiful little boys back on Adalurin, because in fact it did help. I saw it with my own eyes, and I agree with you that I'm a very biased observer. So at the end of the day, I want you to know that I think the world breaks all of us. And Ernest Hemingway really doesn't know, and thankfully he's in his grave, or he probably would be a little offended by my revising his words. I think the world breaks all of us, everyone. And afterward, all of us have to be stronger at the broken places. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pat. Once again, we'll open the session to questions. The microphone's coming up here. I must say, Pat was a little bit, based on our conversation last night, didn't tell the full story of her encounter with the physicians. In fact, Pat is a very, very experienced nurse, including in the ICU, went to one of the leading children's hospitals and was very aware of the signs and symptoms in relation to issues in terms of cardiovascular and other issues related to her children, and tried to point these out to the physicians, and it was just completely written off. And that's a problem. We don't observe anymore. We don't listen anymore. Anyway, let's start off over here.
Hi, Pat. My heart goes to you, of course. I would like to speak as some scientists who write grants to NIH asking for funding, but also serves in study sections reviewing NIH grants. So you're probably aware that this year the NIH has changed the way grants
Yes.
are reviewed, and I'm reviewing 10 grants for a study section called molecular genetics, which could apply to Duchenne and many other diseases. And the first box that I had to fill says overall impact, where the instruction says if the experiments were successfully completed, what would be the overall impact of this proposal on the citizenry, right, on all of us. And then the second box is significance, where again I had to say, okay, why is this significant? And in this study section, I don't, but I may have a grant that, let's say, works on dystrophy or something that relates to a rare disorder versus a proposal that is equally excellent in terms of science, but it deals with the most commonly mutated tumor suppressor gene affecting 500,000 people every year. So it's a very tough spot for the reviewer, and you've gone through this process. We have great science, but we're a very common disease with a huge impact. It's fighting in the same study section with great science and a very rare disease, although rare, of course, is a relative term. So what is the solution to this? Is it to have a study section on muscular dystrophy, so all the people doing muscular dystrophy, they compete among themselves? Is it having a separate pool of money outside of NIH, where people can apply, interested in muscular dystrophy can apply outside of NIH, so they don't have to compete with cancer, Alzheimer's, heart failure, and so on. So let me tell you now, in my experience as a writer of grants, to NIH, I go with a heavy place. I studied gene expression, and I, many years ago, decided to study a transcription factor, a gene regulator, that I know no reviewer will argue about its significance. It is the most commonly mutated tumor suppressor gene. So that box, I always get great rating on that box. Then my science afterwards may be mediocre, but the significance is established by the field before me. However, there are projects in my lab where we have explored, we have gotten out of our main focus because foundations like the March of Dimes, for example, who fund research on birth defects, we saw that as a separate pool of money, where we would be competing with people who are only interested in a subset of diseases. So what is for people like you and for people, I talk to advocates of rare cancers, for example. What is the way of going about getting funds, getting science for your interests? Is it a new study section? Do your independent fundraising? How do you go about that?
So I have two answers. The first one's wrong, but I'll tell it to you anyway. I think the whole world should stop and cure all the kids. So that's wrong, right? I don't know that there's an easy solution, but I think in terms of significance, when you think about Duchenne muscular dystrophy, for instance, when we think about, for instance, the myostatin pathway or the IGF-1 pathway, the regulators of muscle, those are two. If you targeted those in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, they apply to a broad range of patients, right? They apply to the whole aging population and heaven knows what else, and cachexia and cancer. So I think that there are some generalizable approaches, and I think this is where the rare disease community really has to think through how to do it better. I think that foundations like ours should be able to be collaborative and seed these projects. But again, I don't want to be seeding projects where if you go into the review process that actually your significance and applicability of the grant isn't significant. So I think we have to work through that. We are working with Francis Collins and Genetic Alliance and NORD to look at how can we do this better. Because I think for us, we have a $5 million budget, but it's not ever going to be enough. So we always look at leveraging money. How to do that better with others is one of the things that we are looking at. This last year in January, we hired Sharon Hesterly, who was Vice President of the Muscular Dystrophy Association Research, to build a philanthropy program that would look at pathways for us, because I think that might be the way to go, where we look at very nuanced therapies for Duchenne, but I think more realistically, things that will be generalizable. The same with, which is off target again with the Duchenne Connect, with the patient registry, to be more generalizable. And I think that is the only way we're all going to succeed, because frankly, fundraising in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, when there are 15,000 boys in the United States with Duchenne, you chop off at least half of those for socioeconomic reasons. You got a small pool of people, and they have all sorts of needs based on the disease process. So I think we have to look broader and in more creative ways, right? More creative ways to use the collaborative outrage of our communities to change the world of rare disease.
I think you'll write some great grants. I mean, if you want to read mine, I'll be happy.
Okay.
I guess the question that you had about engaging industry, do you see a lot of opportunity in the future with kind of the shift in Big Pharma? I know GSK has shifted, and I'll apologize for using this term, to orphan diseases. And last year they committed $650 million in potential deal value to Prosensa for their exon skipping drug in Duchenne's. And I guess just how you see that opportunity as far as Big Pharma going away from the blockbuster model more to these rare diseases, or kind of a Genzyme model with high revenue per year.
Well, I was on a panel with some folks from Bio, and one of the folks that was on the panel was saying that we don't need a better statin, right? We really want to focus on rare disease. The Prosensa story is a very interesting one. In 1994, we provided a fellowship to a young Judith Van Dudekam, who was at the University of Pittsburgh in our DMD, Duchenne Muscular Dystrophy Research Center, right? Judith was a young upcoming scientist and needed a fellowship, so we provided the $50,000 a year for a couple of years running. We also, as we started PPMD in the US, I met people around the world, so we now have affiliate projects in every country other than the Asian countries, which we're starting. We just started Israel this year, India last year, South Africa. So we are spreading out everywhere. So my Dutch counterpart, Elizabeth Room, and I began to see Judith as she was a young scientist that went back to the Netherlands. Judith's history is that she worked with Gerard Plattenberg. They formed Prosensa. They have the 2-O-methyl compound coming forward on exon 51 and 44. And so we've been seeding her. The total investment in Judith over time has been by the communities, if you will, is about a $15 million investment. So again, it is that leverage, right? We were thrilled to see GSK come on board with their investment. It's just, that's what we want to do, right? We want to toss this off on somebody who's committed to the Duchenne environment and who's capable, and GSK is clearly capable. We are hopeful to do the same with our drug development with PTC, that will grow bigger and bigger. We were able to leverage, we invested about $3 million with PTC on the high throughput screens, and then they were able to get a RAID grant for $15 million, and then a couple private donors came in with another 10. So it is about that building. But I see that there are companies who are interested, and frankly, we are just going there and knocking the doors down. Acceleron has a myostatin inhibitor coming forward. So we are seeing, at least from our point of view, we are seeing more companies come into the rare disease space who find a niche there, and based on the Genzyme model, and I don't know how long that model will hold up, because I don't know, with the healthcare reform, how we're going to be able economically to afford $100,000 a year therapies that have marginal impact. And at this moment, that's what we're looking at, is marginal impact. So I think the kids are worth it. I just don't know how we as a country can afford it.
Thank you.
Hi, Pat. I'm very moved about your talk. And actually, I worked at a muscular dystrophy lab in North Carolina for a while. And I know many parents is very anxious about their boys. And they even call to lab to find some compounds they already screened. So my question today is, your PPMD, did you support some scientific study on muscular dystrophy, and what's your management on this grant, and what's your scientific review process?
So, so it's changed. So early on, the chair of our scientific review investment and process was Lee Sweeney, who's the chair of physiology at the University of Pennsylvania. And then we had a group of 20 ad hoc reviewers, and it would depend on what they were reviewing, who he called in. So we would have at least 3 to 4 reviewers. We didn't do formal RFPs in the first few years of the organization, or I should say until last year. What we really did is target our investment to go out and look for certain things that we were interested in. With Sharon Hesterly on board, we're building a much different system, which includes venture philanthropy. We've already built the GAP program to invest in, to bridge the NIH grants. And so we'll have, similar to R01C grants, we do fellowships and so on. So that should be up online as soon as Sharon gets it all written and it goes through. So we have Lee Sweeney is still there as chair of the research review process, but it's now dramatically expanded with very specific rules and regulations that will be up on site.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pat. Big hand.